It is now 12:01. In the interest of time, I'm going to start by introducing today's conversation and the event today. So my name is Martha Rands. I am the legal director of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society, and we are an organization that is devoted to supporting nonprofits and artists in many different areas of the law. We've had an ongoing interest in ensuring that particularly small nonprofit organizations, but really every nonprofit, have access to good resources on a wide range of topics, and that a lot of them have been through these legal lunch and learns that we've been running since April as a consequence of the pandemic. They're funded in part by the City of Vancouver Social Planning Department that enabled us to start just offering as much as we support as we could to organizations dealing with the pandemic. We do our work on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we thank them for their continuing forbearance of our work on their land. Today is going to be a discussion about breaking the silence. It really is a moment where we're going to break the silence, or some of the silences, around addressing sexual misconduct issues in the workplace, sexual harassment, and arguably touching on many facets of people's lives. I'm extremely gratified that two women who have dedicated their work and their lives to advocating for those whose voices have been minimized and systematically marginalized are willing to share their wisdom with us today. As one of the many women who have lived experience with sexual violence, harassment, and marginalization, I read Julie Macfarlane's new book, Going Public, about her experiences as a complainant, litigant, and a survivor, with an enormous sense of gratitude, because I found myself feeling as though she had given voice to my own story. I was struck in that moment, or in those hours, by how necessary it is to talk about how investigative processes, whether state-sanctioned or internal to a workplace, continue to harm complainants, and I would argue respondents as well. So I asked Clea Parfit, a BC-based human rights lawyer, to join in this conversation. Clea has acted on behalf of complainants and has many of her own ideas about how to improve these processes for complainants and respondents alike. So with that, I'm going to ask Julie to share with us some of her stories from going public.
Thanks very much, Martha. If it's okay, I'm just going to add who I am. This is the book, but I am a law professor, supposedly a distinguished professor at the University of Windsor. I have been working as a law professor for many years and have worked with many, many not-for-profits as well as institutions and other organizations as a mediator, and sometimes as a facilitator of process design for the types of things we're going to be talking about inside workplaces. So I wrote this book because I thought that I could offer a couple of things from a kind of unique perspective. Um, First of all, it was time after 40 years or so of silence for me to speak up about my experiences of sexual violence earlier in my life. I have become increasingly aware of the need to speak up, and not just to speak up in a kind of vague, supportive, Me Too-ish way, but to actually be very direct and open about our experiences. And I'm not by any means saying or advocating that everybody should do this, but I came to the conclusion after many, many years of pondering this that I had a position from which I could go public that would be potentially affirming and empowering for other women, and which in reality presented very little actual risk to me. I have a secure tenured job. I've already behaved just about as badly as the University of Windsor thinks I could possibly behave. And, I'm not going to be fired by them. So I knew that I was in a very privileged position, and I had a bit of a platform as well in terms of my public persona. And so I turned this idea over and over and over and over in my head for many years. Um, and eventually kind of backed myself into a position that I finally had to speak up. And I write about this in the book. Um, there's obviously there's obviously an emotional impact of speaking up and being public. And the fact that I have written in such detail about my earlier experiences of sexual violence and sexual abuse in this book means that there are many, many people now who are going to know these like ugly, sordid details about me. And I have to admit that I do still have occasional moments when I think, holy shit, why did I do that? Um, but, I always come back to my sort of essential goal in this. I actually said to my youngest daughter, who is 21 and an activist herself, um, a couple of months ago, I said to her, Hopi, it's really kind of weird thinking about all the people out there who are going to know all this stuff about me now. And my wonderful 21-year-old activist daughter turned to me and said, "What part of going public, Mum, were you not expecting?" So that kind of put me back in my place. But the other part of writing this book that I thought I could bring a unique perspective to was that I have studied and participated as an outsider in all of the processes in which I now found myself being an actual participant. So I was no longer outside looking in, I was inside experiencing it. I experienced going through, as a complainant, a workplace investigation, having in the past been somebody who might follow up from that investigation as a mediator or take what came out of the investigation and try to carve a solution out. But now I was actually part of an investigation. I made the decision to bring a lawsuit against the Anglican Church as a way of increasing pressure on them to change their internal practices. And so I became a litigant all of a sudden, having studied litigation and written copious amounts about the downfalls and the pitfalls and the dreadfulness of litigation. I suddenly found myself as as a litigant. Um, and I use that process very explicitly to try to change processes. My settlement agreement was a new claims process for claimants bringing sexual abuse cases against the church. And that was a process that I sat and designed with them before I signed a settlement agreement. And then unexpectedly, because somebody else stepped forward about the same individual who had abused me and was the subject of the lawsuit, um, I found myself in a criminal case as well. By this point, the minister who had abused both of us, myself and the other lady, was in Australia. So we went through extradition and then 2 trials because the first trial actually ended in a mistrial. So I testified and was cross-examined twice. So I've written about all of this in the book, and I've written about the additional insight it's given me into how incredibly flawed these processes are. And I have a special interest, ongoing interest, in what that means for organizations. Organizations that um, have deeply invested in appearing to be safe, productive, respectful places for people to work. Universities, churches, not-for-profits, all of these places as institutions hope that they're going to look like very attractive, very respectful, authentic when it comes to dealing with conflict. And in fact, I know that those organizations rarely succeed in doing that when it comes to real transparency, safety for complainants, and how they resolve matters of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, discrimination, and bullying. So that remains my passion to see change in the way that we do that. And hopefully we can talk about some of those issues more specifically today. Thanks, Martha.
Great. Over to you, Clea.
Thank you. So my experience, as Martha has said, is really as counsel addressing some of these internal investigation processes and whether they work and what's wrong with them. And I think when an employee brings forward a complaint of sexual harassment or misconduct or even bullying, there's at that point a tremendously important moment for the employer about what they're going to do next. Hopefully, so I want to talk a bit about what that looks like. Essentially, an employer in that situation has obligations both under the Human Rights Code and under the Workers' Compensation Act health and safety provisions to provide a safe workplace. So when someone comes forward with a complaint, what they're in essence saying is, I don't have a safe workplace. As well as those statutory obligations, of course, employers have obligations to their employees, which may take the form of a collective agreement or may take the form of an employment contract. And they probably have obligations both to the complainants and to whoever's will be responding to that complaint. So clearly it's a moment of legal risk for the employer. The employee who's making the complaint might file a human rights complaint. They might file a lawsuit against the employer for breach of contract. The respondent might, if action is taken against the respondent in particular, or their employment is disrupted in some significant way, they may bring a breach of contract suit. And sometimes we see defamation cases coming out of what's said about employees in these situations. So there's a lot of legal risk, but I want organizations to also think about the risk that there is that they might harm someone with their process, and that it's terribly important to have a process that isn't harmful. And if you think about running a process that's for the purpose of health and safety or for the purpose of the Human Rights Code, it's clearly critical that that process itself not be damaging. And I think, I'm hoping that organizations can refocus somewhat to think about that, as I don't know that that's always top of mind for organizations as they go forward in a situation like this. Employers, of course, are responsible for their workplaces. They're responsible for making policies and rules, for enforcing those, and they go on having that responsibility even when a complaint is made. So they haven't ceded that responsibility to a policy or a process that they may have designed in advance. And it may be necessary for the employer to go on managing the situation, even if they have a process that they're going to also use. The one doesn't override the other. And I think sometimes employers lose track of that. So that means they can act to separate people. They can act to put someone on leave who's a respondent perhaps to prevent further harm. They can act in a disciplinary manner if they're sufficiently satisfied, even at that early stage, that they need to do that to preserve their own interests and to meet their health and safety obligations. So they can act they're not prohibited from acting by having a policy that may also require them to do other things. What seems to me really important, and maybe I'm kind of slow getting to this even myself, is that under health and safety obligations, the employer has an obligation to investigate, to find out what the source of the harm is, what the scope of the bad conduct is, and then how to fix it. And it's probably helpful to think about, if you had a gas flowing into your workplace that somebody flagged for you and said, oh, I think we might have a toxic gas here, you wouldn't just say, well, I'm only going to look at your complaint. I'm not going to look throughout the rest of the employment setting to find out how widespread that is. But I think quite often with these bullying or misconduct cases, the employer seems to be very focused on the narrow question, which is the complainant's story true, rather than the broader question, which is what is going wrong in this workplace and how broad is it? What is the totality of what's gone wrong and how can I fix it? So I think it's really helpful to think about these sort of investigations as having a health and safety sort of / human rights driven purpose from the get-go, and that helps to take away the focus on discipline or a very narrow complaint, which I often think isn't that helpful. It is really critical that employers moving forward to investigate a situation be clear with themselves and with the complainant and with the respondent about what it is that they think they're doing. It seems to me that there's a lot of rhetoric in the places that I've been involved with about how the complaint is for the complainant and the investigation is for the complainant, but that isn't actually the reality almost any of the time. And what we tend to see is that the actual investigation is for the employer to figure out if they want to discipline or terminate, or instead whether they prefer to put their chips in with the respondent and then be very skeptical of the complainant. And I don't think that, as I've already said, I think if you can take an occupational health and safety approach rather than this kind of zero-sum approach, which I think the complaint can sometimes drive and the response to the complaint, that may lead to a more humane investigation and a more complete one. Though, of course, it's going to raise some important questions about how you can have an investigation with sufficient breadth. So I find too often that employers are focused on their own liability, they're focused on which camp they should be in, and they're not focused on, clearly there's a significant problem, we need to address it, by looking at all of the things that are wrong rather than figuring out who we believe more, which often isn't a very constructive perspective to take. And I think fundamentally it's important that employers not create the impression that the investigation is to meet the needs of the complainant unless they're really going to do that. And it may be that Julie will talk a little bit about some of the emerging material about, what happens when promises are made or that people will be helped or have their interests looked after, that then when that doesn't actually happen. So Julie, maybe I can turn then to asking a question of you. What is your advice for a workplace trying to create a process that people will actually use?
And one that they might want to use as
Yeah.
well. You know, as somebody who's done a lot of work designing processes for workplaces, I know that there are a lot of fantastic processes out there that nobody actually ever uses. And I think that if you have a process at the moment in your own organization, or you're thinking about a process, then you can't just assume that if you put a process in place that people will automatically use it. There has to be, obviously, trust in the process, and there has to be a great deal of information about what being in that process would involve. I would certainly recommend, for those of you who are thinking about putting a process in place, that you try to involve your employees in creating that process. And I've certainly facilitated a lot of that thinking in the past. What kinds of issues do you want to address? What are the systemic issues? And how could you create a process that people would actually feel comfortable with? But a couple of things that I've noticed along the way that I think no one thing is the magic bullet, but which are important to creating a process that people feel comfortable to use. The first is, how do you actually identify something within your workplace as misconduct? I think that this is a cultural question for every workplace, and it's something that every workplace has to themselves decide. But we all know, and I write about this in my book, of situations that we have been in the past, whether that is a working situation or just a social situation, where particular kinds of behavior have become normalized, even though we might look back over time and think, what was going on there? So I think the first thing you have to confront is just, what does your organizational culture do with bullying, with, what might be seen as minor acts of sexual harassment? I mean, what kind of culture do you want to build around this? You don't want a culture in which everybody is terrified of doing something wrong, but you do want one that it is possible for people to call out bad behavior. And this is my second point: when they do call out that bad behavior, they have somewhere to go to, that they don't feel they're immediately going to be in the public scrutiny of everybody else. One of the roles that I've sometimes worked on creating within organizations is a confidential listener who isn't necessarily part of a complaints process, but who is simply somebody who you can go to and talk about what you might do. Because I think one of the things, and Clea and I have talked about this, one of the things that people don't always understand is there's a big gap between calling out a bad behavior or disclosing some kind of a harm that's been done to you, and actually wanting to go into a formal investigation, reporting and investigation process. One of the things that regularly happens at universities, where we now have increasingly sexual violence coordination officers, places people can go, is students won't go because the minute they set foot in that place, they are expected to make a formal complaint. And they're not necessarily ready to. They need to have another kind of conversation, or maybe many conversations, before they're ready to do that. So you have to be careful about that kind of transition from disclosing or calling out harm to actually wanting to report. And then, what would make it welcoming? What would make people feel like they wanted to participate in the process? I would say, first of all, they need a lot of information about how it works. It's astonishing how often people within organizations have only the vaguest idea of how an internal complaints or discipline process actually works. Or they have read it and they don't understand it because it's written in legal gobbledygook. Something else that's very important, that it should be written in very clear and accessible language. I believe that it's critical that complainants should be given confidentiality, that their circumstances that they are disclosing, the events that they're talking about, are not going to be available in the future to anyone other than the person taking that information from them, and the individuals who will see the final report, which should include, of course, the complainants themselves. And let me come back to that in a moment. And I think for any kind of investigation process, people have to be told they can bring somebody with them to that interview, that they can review the notes or the recording that was made of whatever they said in that interview, so they have full control over that. And that they are not told, which is again something that people are told all the time, you mustn't talk to anybody. I mean, we have to assume that in order to go through this, people are going to need support. We have to assume that. I think that you have to think very carefully about to whom the results of an investigation go. I know of innumerable cases, and I'm working on a number at the moment, where those reports are never seen by the complainants, which I believe is actually legally not sustainable, that they have a right under, at least in Ontario, under the health and safety legislation, to see that report. So you want to set up a system in which it's transparent, that the complainants know they will see the report and they will know who else it will go to. Will it go to your board? Will it just go to your head of HR. I mean, whatever your organization is, you need to know who's going to see that report. You need to plan all this in advance, not be making it up as you go along. And the complainant needs to know this before they go into the process. I went through an investigation, workplace investigation at the University of Windsor about 4 years ago now, where the student complainants were not guaranteed confidentiality. They were not given support. They were told to speak to nobody. They were not allowed to review the notes of the interviewer. They were never given the report at the end, and they were completely excluded from everything that happened next, all the decisions that followed. This is a perfect example of what Clea was talking about earlier, of the problem that we do see systemically. And I'm sorry to be sort of negative about this, but we're trying to be negative, I think, in the hopes that you can do better, of a process that actually wasn't built for the complainant at all. It was just built for the employer to resolve their liability issues, in this case, when they fired a tenured professor. The complainants were, chopped liver. They were nothing. They were just the people that they fed into this machine to get a report in order to do something, and then they became completely, completely irrelevant. And I think that is, a real object lesson of how badly this can go.
And I think it's a good example of folk doing a disciplinary investigation where what's at stake are the interests of the employer and the interests of the respondent, instead of doing an occupational health and safety investigation where everyone's interests are at stake. The people who made the complaint, the people responding to it, everyone else in the workplace, people like yourself who would have been supporting those students and who are in fact, for whom it is in fact a workplace, whereas for students, it's a service provider environment. So, I think the conception that an organization begins with as they step through the door of these processes is terribly important, because it will drive the next things that happen. And, I think universities are genuinely perplexed about why complainants think they should get a report that's coming to them to decide how they should discipline someone.
Right.
To them, that seems like a crazy. I was in court on Monday and the lawyer on the other side was like, she's trying to change the world if she thinks people can have that information. And it's like,
right.
I get that you don't get that because you're
Right.
thinking of it in this very narrow context.
Exactly.
When in fact, it needs to be thought of in a much broader context.
So Clea, can I ask you, given that we're sort of doing a bit of the doomsday scenario here and saying, here are the ways that all these processes get really messed up. If people on this call are thinking about how can they make a better process or maybe a process from scratch, and we know there's this tension between trying to meet the needs of a complainant and the employer's focus on their liability. So how can an organization be transparent about that tension and balance those needs? How can they do that?
Well, I think I really liked your idea of a confidential listener position. I do think that before people get engaged in any kind of investigation, they should be getting external advice about what their options are. And one of the things that's really notable about an internal investigation process is that it focuses on the conduct of the respondent, which is good, but it completely obliterates the conduct of the employer and the role of the employer in providing a safe workplace. And I really noticed that in contrast to when someone brings a human rights complaint saying, I've been sexually harassed at work, or I've been, subject to a discriminatory environment because, in some way related to my personal characteristics. The tribunal's attention is completely focused on the employer. And often it's a fight with the tribunal to get them to actually name the individual respondent. And so these internal processes do tend to make invisible the role of the employer. And it's important for people who are making a choice about what to do next as a complainant to understand the difference between an internal process and what it's going to be looking at and what it's going to generate as a response or an outcome versus an external process, which will be more where the complainant is a party inevitably, and where the complainant drives the process, where the process is about inquiring about their complaint, and where the remedy comes to them personally, rather than being something the employer is doing. So they're processes with different objectives, and it's really important for people have to understand the range of options they have at the beginning. So I really like the confidential listener position. I think the mind shift that I'm suggesting from an investigation of a complaint to a kind of health and safety investigation helps to recenter everyone's interest in a safe workplace, and to make that more the focus than who's guilty and who's innocent, who should be believed. And, it kind of takes that adversarial piece of it maybe and sets it a bit to one side, although it's never truly going to be set to side. So I think that's an important, I think that's really important. I do think this question of confidentiality is endlessly thorny, but I like your idea of, that the person can come and tell their story, and even when they make a formal complaint, we'll know who will and will not see it. And I think it's terribly important to work that out in advance if you can, including, does the board have to know? Does the whole board have to know? Does the ED know? Does it reside in HR? Are you a big enough organization? And it's difficult when the board doesn't know, because these are potential liability situations. So yeah, I think it's important for the complainant to know who will see it, but I also think it's extremely important for complainants to retain control of their own story. And so I don't think that the requirement, and I think you've said this as well, I don't think the requirement of confidentiality should prevent a complainant from talking to whoever they need to talk about. And it may be that if you're doing a more conventional investigation, you may want to take into account that there's been a conversation. So it might be fair to ask about it, but it isn't fair to say you can't have a conversation.
No. I mean, this reminds me of what we've always done with mediation, which is we've had to, set confidentiality and who's going to know and who isn't. But you have to live with the reality as well, that somebody's going to go home and tell their partner, or they're going to need to have somebody to speak about it. And I think, all of these sort of reality checks are really important to have a process that a complainant's really going to want to be a part of. And I love your points, Clea, about how the focus should be on building a workplace culture that is healthy and respectful. But I know from many conversations I've had with heads of institutions, I'm thinking of let's see, school board superintendents, university provosts, archbishops, and it is remarkable the consistency with which they tell me that they're sure that the particular misconduct that we're discussing is unique and will never happen again. And I often try to say, this is a systemic problem. This kind of bullying or harassment or sexual abuse, it's a societal problem. Oh no, I'm sure we'll never see it again. We just have to deal with this. So, the workplace has to get its head around the idea that there are individual complainants, but there are systemic problems. And, each time they do this, it's practice to do it better the next time. And on that point, I do want to get something in. I know we have to go to questions as well, but I want to get something in about settlement negotiations. Can I do that?
Yeah. So can I frame that before we jump there?
Yeah, please do.
So, a process will exist, whether it's really a disciplinary investigation or whether it's a health and safety investigation. It will produce a report. We've talked about the fact that we think that report should be shared with the complainants, and particularly that would be a requirement as it's a health and safety investigation. But then often at that point or at some earlier point, negotiations will be entered into between the employer and the respondent, who have, after all, this contractual relationship, about perhaps severing that relationship and what that would look like. And it's not really part of the investigation. So it can happen really at any point in the process, but how that relates to the original complainant is a really thorny question. So Julie, go ahead and talk.
Thanks. So that's a great setup. Because yes, I mean, what we see when somebody is going to be investigated is quite often that they will jump, before being pushed. Or at the conclusion of an investigation, they may, be told they're terminated, and that will give rise to a negotiation over the basis on which they're leaving. Or this is, my experience, I've seen this a number of times, in order to, there will be a grievance process available to people in larger organizations through their trade union. And so while everybody is kind of, shaping up for an arbitration, there will be a settlement negotiation. And of course, what happens, just like you say, Clea, is that is between the employer and the employee. That does not include the complainant. And what is extremely common in those negotiations, I mean, this has really become a default in legal practice, is that part of what will be offered to the respondent is a non-disclosure agreement. They will ask for it, or it will be expected that they will be offered it. That non-disclosure agreement will encourage the respondent to settle and leave without dragging this out or threatening litigation or bad publicity or any of the other things they might do. So it's definitely, sweetening the deal. But what it means in practice is that the next school, university, hospital, not-for-profit arts group that hires this person will do so with absolutely no idea whatsoever about why they left their last position. This has been described in some of the literature as passing the trash. And I have to say I'm rather fond of that phrase because I think it absolutely sums up what's going on here. It is often said that these non-disclosure agreements are to protect complainants, that it's to avoid anything ever coming out about this that might be embarrassing to them. But insofar as complainants are ever part of non-disclosure agreements, which characteristically in an employment setting, they're not anyway, but when they are, what they're being asked to do is also keep quiet about everything that happened and to do so forever. If they wanted to be protected, they could be protected in a confidentiality clause that would not reveal who they were. There's no reason for a non-disclosure agreement. And as we've seen in some of the more high-profile cases, sometimes people after a length of time do want to speak up. And in particular, if they see that this person has now moved on to another environment in which they are sexually harassing women again, for example, and that is not what their goal is. So I think that one of the things that we have to get over here is that NDAs are the norm. NDAs in this situation are absolutely, I believe, immoral. I also believe that they will eventually be illegal and unenforceable on the grounds of public policy, as we're beginning to see happening in the United States, because of the danger that is created by passing a known abuser or known harasser onto another place. But I would say to everybody listening that, don't believe your lawyers when they tell you, oh, everybody does an NDA, we have to do it. You don't have to do it. In bargaining, which I've taught for 30 years now, negotiation, if something gets taken off the table and it's just not available, then you just go on bargaining and you find something else. That's the way it goes.
Yeah, I look forward to running the first human rights complaint on an NDA being broadly discriminatory against whoever the target of the person was, because clearly the purpose of an NDA is for people not to be forewarned. And I've got a client at the moment who was assaulted in the workplace by someone powerful in the workplace. And, they went into sort of investigation mode, and she was told under the collective agreement, she couldn't talk to anyone. So all the bads were there. And she became really concerned that he was going to assault someone else in the workplace, and she needed to warn the other women that she'd been working with. And so she did, which immediately prompted a really scoldy letter, a frankly threatening discipline letter from the employer saying, you're not allowed to talk about this. And that's not a real way to treat women. Women should look out for one another when issues are going on and should warn one another. And but also they shouldn't be left to have to do it in this way that then creates this personal risk to them. So yeah, I agree that I think what I would say about non-disclosure agreements is sign them at your peril, because I think they're going to create liability for you potentially in the future. And, I think someone's going to find out that this guy is a bad guy, and then they're going to come back to you because you didn't warn them. And,
Right,
whether that's
exactly.
another victim or whether it's another employer, I think you should feel the risk of entering into that and not see it as a solution.
Yeah, and it comes back to your original point, Clea, that this is about creating healthy workplaces. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, that's not just the one that you're currently in, it's all the other hypothetical workplaces out there that this person might end up in.
I see Martha's trying to interject. Let's go to some
Let's
questions.
let her.
Martha.
Well, I think the healthy workplace is really the motivation for having this conversation, and it's something that I know that in the work that I do, also in the legal work that I do, that dealing with often very small and under-resourced nonprofits, it's a minefield, and I think that employers are also looking at internal investigation processes as some kind of, oh, here's how we'll deal with it, rather than looking at, say, discipline and looking at the ongoing harm of keeping somebody who has been accused of less than ideal behavior. And I'm trying to be broad when I say that, not minimizing, keeping them in the workplace while the investigation is ongoing. Meanwhile, of course, what happens is complainants will take a leave of absence from that workplace in order to preserve their mental health, because they find it difficult to have to work in the same workplace as someone who's engaged in whatever the conduct is.
And my view is that's really problematic. If the approach of the employer leaves the respondent in the workplace and forces the complainant on to leave, that there may be an argument that that response is discriminatory. So I think that, you know, that isn't a very good solution generally in my view.
Yeah, and you know, you've touched on a lot of the issues that I asked you to touch on and that come up a lot. I do have one question, just quickly, Clea. In Ontario, it seems as though there is a right to see the report, if I understood correctly. What would be the legal basis? Could we make that argument here in BC?
Well, I think the point that I've been really trying to make is let's refocus these investigations as a health and safety investigation rather than what they've often traditionally been, which is a disciplinary investigation. I think in that context, an investigation is required. So I don't think you have a choice not to investigate, but it may not be the only thing that you do, including you may take a disciplinary approach before you get into the detailed investigation. But as to when there's been a health and safety issue in the workplace and a report is produced by the employer, it goes to WorkSafe. But I expect through FOI the employees can see it, but I don't actually know if they have a right to it. And it's an interesting question, which I will look at. I don't like if you have an explosion in your workplace, do all the employees have a right to look at that report? Maybe through a freedom of information request, but I'm not sure if they would be. I believe they won't be getting it in their inbox. So I'm not sure what the actual law on that is, but it seems to me it's a better route to getting the report than the route we often have to go through, which is, often we hear privacy legislation prevents it. I think there's an exception in privacy legislation for sharing information that's necessary for health and safety, which obviously I think these reports are, at least to the complainant. I think the complainant's health and safety is very damaged if they don't see the report. But it's an ongoing fight where the employers often are trying to find a way not to show the report, which I really don't support. Like, I find it appalling that you would force someone to be your witness and then you wouldn't tell them the meaning you'd made out of what they told you. It just, from a human point of view, it's a really terrible thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, and I can't tell you exactly how it's being argued in Ontario, but I know that the lawyer who's acting for me at the moment has made an argument on this, which has been successful a couple of times, and she will be reprising it in my case.
I look forward to finding out what that argument is and how to make it here.
I'm going to connect you.
Mm-hmm.
I can't hear either of you.
Oh. We can hear one another.
Okay, that's good. I can hear. Sorry about that. My internet connection is unstable, I'm told.
I see. Okay, well, we can still hear one another, so I think it might be you. So Martha, do you want to pitch to questions now?
Yep. Yep. So I have a question here. How do you navigate the transition time between someone disclosing and making a formal complaint? If the disclosure is about another employee who may repeat this behavior, how do you protect the rest of your staff?
Well, to me, that is the fundamental problem with any kind of disclosure, quote unquote, process that does not involve a go forward. And I think what, if I understand what Julie's saying correctly, what she's suggesting is a person who isn't the employer per se, who would be the listener. So the employer doesn't have notice, because I agree that once the employer has notice, the protecting the complainant probably under occupational health and safety has to give way to protecting the rest of the employees. I agree. I think once the I think if who the person is talking to represents the employer, you should not be telling the complainant that you can't act on what they're telling you, because in fact, I think you have to act on it. And it's an argument that I've made to the university. And UBC has created a policy where they have disclosure and reporting. And I think it's extremely difficult for them to get disclosure and not to act. Even though that may be what complainants want, I think it's very problematic for the employer.
Yeah, I mean, I just say that means again, that it is really important for people to have a place they can go to that they know will not end automatically mean that they're making a formal complaint. And I hear this so often from people that they kind of went over that line without meaning to. And I think if you don't have a clear distinction, then you're not going to have people who want you to come forward at all.
Yeah, and so I think it is very difficult, but I think the bottom line of it is they have to be disclosing to someone who's not the entity.
Right.
And where the entity, there's no expectation that the entity will know, and the entity will not actually know, so that they do not have an obligation to act.
Yeah, this is, I think, where the idea of a confidential listener is really interesting, because it does put in a kind of buffer and allow for people to unpack what they're experiencing, process it however they need to, and short of taking that step towards disclosure, particularly where perhaps the issues are multifaceted, and it does take time, I think, for people to really get a handle on what exactly is happening to them. And some of it is that voice in the back of your head: am I crazy? Is this really happening to me? And it's only when you actually start talking about it or processing it with someone who would be in that kind of confidential listener role, that you're able to go, aha, that's it. That's what's happening. That's what I need. And then you're either going to go, I'm empowered now and able to manage that formal complaints process, where there might be disclosure and what will follow, or conversely, that actually there's other circumstances that would suggest I'm not going to do that. It isn't worth it. I don't need to fight that battle today.
And I would say that, we have a model already that exists in a lot of workplaces, which is the employee assistance program. A lot of workplaces have contracted an external person to provide
Right.
a fairly small number of counseling sessions for emotional issues that might arise. And why not use a similar format to create a confidential listener?
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily suggesting it would be the same person, because I would wonder about the training and ability of an EAP person to provide that information. But, frankly, it could be handled in the same way that employee assistance plans are handled, where you just have an externally contracted confidential listener who can walk you through it, who can talk to you about your options, and who isn't the employer and is not allowed to share what they know, just as an EAP counselor doesn't share, theoretically at least, doesn't share what they know with the employer. So, I mean, I don't always trust that, but nonetheless, I think, you can set up a system that would work fine, I think.
Yeah. One of the questions is, what training do you think is needed for the confidential listener, and then how do they interact with the organizational leadership in the absence of a formal process?
Well, I think that someone who's acting as a confidential listener obviously needs to have some kind of counseling training. I would also suggest that they, and I've done this myself, they would probably benefit from having kind of basic conflict resolution training that would enable them to help somebody talk through and get some insight into what they're experiencing. I mean, Clea mentioned earlier on that, this is important for the emotional dimension of this. And there's always an emotional dimension. In every single case, there's an emotional dimension because this is something that somebody feels is harming them and, affecting their workplace performance. So I would certainly say that they would need to have some basic conflict resolution training, perhaps a counseling background. And as Clea has just said, incredibly important that they have some clearly established relationship with the employer such that they are not going to be reporting for occupational health and safety reasons, whether they are independent of the organization or simply somebody inside the organization. Now, it's complicated if it's somebody inside the organization. I mean, I liked Clea's idea. I mean, I think that many people could just use their EAP to have some of these conversations. But to have a confidential listener inside the organization, is always complicated because then people wonder, although this isn't the case at the moment, why somebody is going to see them. The other thing I would say in terms of training for the confidential listener is that so much of what I at least, see and have reported to me and have been involved in around misconduct in workplaces and harm in workplaces does relate to sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. And it's important that the person who has this role understands the dynamics of sexual misconduct, understands the power dynamics that are often at the heart of that, where somebody with more power is assaulting or abusing or harassing somebody with less power. Because I have, had terrible experiences of not confidential listeners, but investigators saying to complainants, well, it just sounds like he fancies you. I mean, it just sounds like he likes you, without actually understanding what it is that's going on. And someone in the questions, Martha, also asked about the qualifications of an investigator, and I think maybe Clea and I can both say something about that too, because it's related. I think that at the moment we have a very low standard, I have to say, of competence and best practice around sexual misconduct investigations. It needs to be much better, and a prime qualification needs to be an understanding of the dynamics of power in sexual harassment. I also think that investigators themselves should start to think about a professional code of conduct for best practice, in which they always set out terms of reference, that they always make clear going in what will happen with complainants and how their information will be used. And I have seen many investigations that didn't do any of these things. I mean, they were just completely ad hoc. It was astonishing to me. So I think that they need to have training in being able to speak to somebody who has experienced trauma, understanding of the dynamics of sexual violence and sexual power. And in some cases, yeah, they will also need to have legal training, but I don't think that is always the case. And we are absolutely in need of a code of best practice. So I think if you are hiring an investigator, you ought to be asking them these questions and make sure that they have answers to them before you hire them.
Yes, and in terms of the question about who a confidential listener should be, clearly, I think it's really critical that they understand the different, I mean, someone who's been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted has a lot of different options. They have if they're dealing with a sexual assault, you have a criminal option, you have a civil option, you have a human rights option, you have a internal complaint option, which then you have the option of, probably of having some sort of mediated process or some sort of actual investigation, and trying to navigate how all those options differ and what they offer. You need someone who can assist you to talk about that. And I think this actually is a service that organizations like Battered Women's Support Services are providing to people, so that they can be a confidential listener, and they are experts at telling people what the options are. So there is some community resource in that respect that organizations who haven't set up something themselves could refer people to. But it does seem really important to me that before someone launches in, they have that conversation so that they actually have some idea generally that they're making the right choice. And then they need to have some idea about the questions to ask about the specific process so that they get reasonable, get a reasonable process. And then in terms of the investigator, I really love your idea of some kind of standard. And I think it's extremely important that they be knowledgeable about what, the meaning to make of behavior of complainants, because I think there's so many myths about, how someone would behave if this had really happened.
Exactly.
And people really don't, people go on seeing their abusers and their harassers
Yeah.
because they're part of their social environment. And part
Right.
of the thing that's so frightening is to fracture or rupture that social environment. So to make the
Yeah.
meaning that he can't have really abused or harassed you because you still saw him is to totally miss the point about what's going on in a lot of these situations. So yeah, you need to have someone who's really knowledgeable. And I feel very discouraged at the investigation reports I'm seeing.
Me
I think
too.
they're often just gruelingly
They're
bad.
just awful. They're just
Awful.
awful
Yeah.
sometimes. It's amazing to me.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and I think if I may just step in, because we are almost at the end of our time here, is that, there's two things I've observed very recently. One is terms of reference are absolutely critical.
Yeah.
These things need to be set out in advance, and
Yeah.
they need to be as comprehensive as you can possibly make it. And if you have a complainant who is asking a direct question, then it is your obligation to answer that direct question in the process, in the terms of reference. And what we're dealing with right now, we've been talking a lot about sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, which in many ways, there's so many examples of litigation and other cases we can look to. What I'm seeing a lot of right now are way more, or not more complicated, but more nuanced. We're talking about as intersectional issues where we're dealing with racialized, disabled women, men, gender non-conforming, all at the same time, and expectation and ways in which behavior may be construed um, in one setting may not work in another setting, and that it isn't just about sexual harassment. It's about how, when we talk about respectful workplaces, when we talk about everyone's interests and getting and cleaning up a toxic workplace, it means all of those things. It's the microaggressions that women of color and Black and Indigenous folks have been reminding us daily about, these cultural biases and our willingness to express these things, and how when you are in a workplace, people feel disempowered. And when it's continual, there may be one example that says where somebody said something that was directly sexist or racist or whatever. And underlying that is a litany of belittlement and humiliating and raised voices and talking over or whatever. And I think it really needs to be looked at as the purpose of this exercise really needs to be, how do we not create more harm? Somebody is coming to us and telling you that something has happened that has harmed them. We have an obligation, I think, collectively, to listen to this and to start taking it really seriously and opening ourselves up. And I would add that the board, which can be extremely risk averse, has to get over its own internal risk aversion and insist that its standard be raised as well. If you need to get training, get training. If you need to spend money, spend the damn money, because that will ensure a better outcome for everybody. if I had $1 for every time a board has been saying, well, we don't have any resources available to do this, but you're going to X conference or Y conference in whatever aspect it is, and you're not investing in the very people that are making it possible for you to do the work, that's where we start to see the issue. And I think funders have to put way more effort and attention into these issues. We should not need a small army of lawyers, every organization, in order to fix these problems. We need resources, and I will end now because I can go on a tear and you both know that, but I'll end now by just telling everyone today that is in BC, if you are not aware of the sexual harassment, the SHARP clinic, which enables complainants to get 5 hours of legal advice through SHARP, it's sexual harassment and ARP, I can't remember, in any event. We have provided the link on the blurb, and we will send it to everyone. I also really encourage you to reach out to the Community Legal Assistance Society for help with a human rights complaint. Look to those resources, because the more we look to those resources, and God forbid they can't meet all of our needs, the better able we will be to make the case to government that they have to do more. 5 hours is not enough. We need more support across the board. And if WorkSafe really wants safe and respectful workplaces, then they need to find the funding within their own envelope or demand it from government to fully fund a system that would enable them to get information, education, and legal advice to make real the promise of a respectful workplace for everyone. How do you like them apples? So thank you so much, Julie, for making time today for us. I can't tell you how much less lonely my work feels having read that book.
Oh, I'm so glad, Martha.
And Clea, thank you also for giving us an hour to have what I think is an extremely rich conversation about how we can, in fact, stop harm in our workplaces, or at least make an effort in that direction. So thank you all, all of you, for coming. And as I said, we will send along some resources, and thank you. Bye.
Pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Clea.
Thank you, Julie.
Bye, everyone.